of like on a diagonal.
Mm.
Bleecker Street and 7th Avenue crossed
Yeah.
what you might say at right angles, but the fact was that we crossed more on a probably a 70-degree angle. So our apartment on Bleecker Street, which was at the end of Bleecker Street, we could look out on 7th Avenue. We could look up maybe 3/4 of a block on 7th Avenue. And Roosevelt was coming down 7th Avenue that day in an open car.
Wait, Teddy Roosevelt?
No,
No,
Franklin.
Franklin Roosevelt.
Okay.
I'm not that old.
Teddy was old.
Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And so we were all at the window waiting for him to come. And I thought we were looking at George Washington because I'd heard the president is coming down in an open car. So as far as I was concerned, the president was George Washington. That was before Pearl Harbor.
That was,
Yeah.
Do you remember Pearl Harbor? Like
I remember that it happened and people talking about it and what does it mean, you know?
Yeah.
But that's all
I knew it was very bad.
It didn't, you know, it didn't. I don't think I
You remember
fully
where you were when
understood the impact of it all. You know?
But Mom, you heard on the radio?
Well, my parents were listening
We
to
were-
the radio,
I don't know. The family was talking about it, right?
and they were talking about it. Henry
Well, my
was-
father was pretty much draft age, so
Hmm.
there was probably some concern that he was going to get drafted.
My
Did he?
father was a warden. He went out at night to make sure. We had blackout curtains. They said New York City would be a target.
Yeah.
So we had blackout curtains. There were no lights that should be visible from the air. So the area wardens would go out, and if they saw a light, they'd let you know you got to turn your light off or pull
They
your
would blow a
shade down.
whistle.
Yeah, they
Oh,
would blow
yeah.
a whistle. And yeah, he did that.
Huh.
And we had drills in school, and we all wore these little plastic chains that had a disc on it that had our name, our birth date, a certain number, and NYC, New York City, in case we were bombed, and they had to identify our bodies.
Yeah, it doesn't make you feel very good as a kid
No.
to know that could happen. Yeah.
It wasn't until many years later I found out there were submarines off the Jersey coast.
They sank a couple of them off there. Yep.
Yeah. Well, they.
That was the very early war, and then I read a book about it was by a German U-boat commander, and he was one of the very few who survived World War II. By the end of the war, they were losing about 90% of their patrols and their crew.
Because we broke
And
their
we figured
code.
out, broke their code, and we knew how to
Yeah,
get
radar.
sonar, and it was 10. You only had a 10% chance of survival. And he was the guy. His submarine carried gold. That I forget the story exactly now, but just before the end of the war, they carried some boxes from Germany all the way down to Italy, and trying to hide something.
Who was
think
this?
It was a book by a German submarine commander. German submarines were very effective at the beginning of the World War II.
They sunk a
killed
lot
a
of
lot
troop
of-
ships and
a lot of
cargo
merchant
ships.
ships. Yeah, my dad was he served in the Coast Guard as a destroyer escort, so he was escorting the convoys across the Atlantic.
Do you guys remember where you were, what you were doing on VE and VJ Day?
I remember.
Oh, I remember very well. I was in Rhinebeck on VJ Day visiting my cousin Rose, whose husband was in the Japanese, fighting the
yeah.
Japanese.
Right. Yeah.
And when the whole town went absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
They ran into the drugstore, which had these soda fountains.
Yeah.
They ran out with these things of ice cream cones,
Oh.
and they're handing it to all the kids. The fire trucks were going around.
Oh,
Kids
yeah,
were on it.
yeah.
Everybody was screaming and hooting and hollering.
This was in Hyde
went-
Park?
No, this was in Rhinebeck. She lived in Rhinebeck.
Gotcha.
She worked at the hospital there.
Uh-huh.
They lived there when I was a kid. And she went, I remember she went to Good Shepherd Church, was in Rhinebeck. She wasn't Catholic, to thank God that the war was over.
I remember VE Day. My father came home from work early, came running up the stairs, said, "Okay, everybody into the car." We didn't know what was happening. We
Where
all
were you
went
living
down.
in?
We were living in 239 West 230th Street.
Mhm.
And we all went down, we get in the car, and we drove down to 48th Street, got out of the car, parked the car somewhere, and we walked over to Times Square,
Oh,
and
wow.
it was Bedlam in Times Square.
Yeah.
Big celebration was
You were
on.
in Times
Oh,
Square.
yeah.
Awesome.
And I remember we bought 2 horns. They were about this big.
Yeah.
My sister got one, and I got one. And we just kept walking around
Sure.
blowing these horns. And we had the horns for so many years stored in one of the closets in 239. And we wrote down what was happening that day on pieces of paper, and we stuck them into the horns,
Oh, yeah.
okay, to save them.
Huh.
And somebody threw the horns out.
Mm.
We lost them.
Well, that's cool. You're in Times Square.
Huh?
That's pretty interesting that you
Indeed.
were down in Times
Did you see
Square.
a sailor kissing a girl?
I heard that happen.
There's a famous picture.
Or at least
There's
it's
a famous picture
set up
of
to
that.
happen.
Yes.
Well, my father was
It's kissing a nurse. That's right.
That's
my
right.
father was 1A in the draft board then,
Hmm.
so he was pretty close to being drafted.
You were drafting fathers at that point.
He was 31 when the war broke out, so he was okay. But as the war went on,
Yeah,
They
you were
kept-
higher up.
raising the level or the ages at which they were drafting guys. And he worked for the Railway Express, and it was not considered a high priority job, but it was involved in rail transportation, and so he was deferred. He had like 2S and 2B and so forth. But then in the early part of, I think it was 1944, he got classified as 1A,
Wow.
which meant that he was
He would have gone.
he was ripe.
Wow.
So he was especially happy when the war ended, as was my mother too, I'm sure.
Sure.
I didn't understand it all at the time.
Yeah.